The hammer struck iron with a thunderous clang, but Ben Cadwell's attention snapped away from his forge when he heard the desperate scream echoing from the abandoned mill. Sweat gleaming on his muscled arms, the blacksmith dropped his tools and sprinted toward the sound, his heavy boots pounding against the dusty earth of Millbrook Valley. What he discovered made his blood run cold. A young woman with auburn hair hung suspended from rusted chains in the mill's cellar, her wrists raw, then bleeding, her emerald dress torn and stained. Her captor, a wiry man with cruel eyes named Cornelius Vex, stood over her with a branding iron glowing red-hot. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't done anything wrong." Ben's rage exploded like molten steel. Without hesitation, he charged down the creaking wooden stairs, his massive frame filling the narrow stairwell. Vex spun around, startled, but Ben was already upon him. The blacksmith's iron-hard fist connected with the smaller man's jaw, sending him crashing into the stone wall with bone-crushing force. "Who are you?" Ben demanded, turning to the chained woman as Vex crumpled unconscious to the floor. "Eliza Renwood," she gasped, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face. He accused me of stealing from his store. Said he'd make an example of me." Ben examined the heavy iron shackles binding her wrists. These weren't ordinary restraints. They were custom-forged, designed to cause maximum suffering. His craftsman's eye recognized the cruel artistry immediately. Working quickly, he produced a set of lockpicks from his leather apron, his steady hands making short work of the mechanisms despite their complexity. As the chains fell away, Eliza collapsed into his arms, her body trembling from exhaustion and terror. Ben caught her gently, his calloused hands surprisingly tender as he supported her weight. "You're safe now," he murmured, his deep voice resonating with quiet strength. "I won't let anyone hurt you." But even as he spoke those words, Ben noticed something that made his heart race: burn marks on Eliza's arms that looked suspiciously like the brand marks he'd seen on runaway slaves. This wasn't just about theft. There was something far more sinister happening in their peaceful village. Eliza looked up into his kind brown eyes, seeing strength and compassion there that she'd never experienced before. "Why did you save me?" she whispered. "Because leaving you there wasn't an option," Ben replied simply, lifting her effortlessly in his powerful arms. "Can you tell me what really happened?" As they climbed out of that hellish cellar, leaving Vex groaning in the darkness below, Eliza began to speak in halting whispers about a network of corruption that reached deep into Millbrook Valley's most respected families. What she revealed would change both their lives forever. The afternoon sun felt like a blessing on their faces as Ben carried her toward his forge. But both of them knew their troubles were just beginning. Vex had powerful friends, and freeing Eliza had made Ben their enemy. But as he looked down at the brave woman in his arms, Ben Cadwell made a silent vow that would echo through the coming storm. Whatever forces had put those chains on Eliza Renwood would have to go through him first. 3 days after the rescue, Ben's forge had become a fortress. He'd barricaded the windows and kept his heaviest hammers within arm's reach while Eliza recovered on a makeshift bed near the warmth of his fire. Her wounds were healing, but the fear in her eyes remained whenever footsteps approached outside. "They'll come for me," she whispered, watching Ben work on a horseshoe, his movements precise and powerful despite the tension that coiled through his shoulders. Vex wasn't working alone. Ben's hammer paused mid-strike. "Then tell me everything, all of it." Eliza's hands trembled as she began her story. She'd been working as a seamstress for the wealthy Grimsby family when she'd accidentally discovered ledgers hidden in Mrs. Grimsby's sewing room. The numbers told a horrifying tale: human trafficking disguised as an employment agency, with young women disappearing into forced labor throughout the territory. "I tried to leave quietly," Eliza continued, her voice growing stronger. "But they caught me at the stage depot. Said I'd stolen jewelry, but it was all lies to discredit me before I could expose them." Ben set down his hammer and turned to face her fully. In the firelight, she looked fragile yet fierce, like tempered steel. That had been tested but not broken. Something deep in his chest tightened as he realized how close he'd come to losing someone he barely knew but already couldn't imagine living without. "The Grimsby family runs half this county," he said grimly. "They own the sheriff, the judge, probably the preacher too. Which is why I have to disappear," Eliza replied, struggling to sit up straighter. "They'll never stop hunting me. No." The word came out harder than Ben intended. "Running won't solve this. Those ledgers you saw, do you remember the details?" Eliza nodded slowly. "Every name, every date, every transaction. I have a good memory for numbers." A plan began forming in Ben's mind, dangerous but necessary. Then we don't run. We fight. Over the next hour, they crafted their strategy. Ben would use his connections with other tradesmen to gather evidence while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Eliza would remain hidden but help document everything she remembered. It was risky, but it was their only chance to stop the trafficking ring and clear her name. As night fell, their first test came. Heavy boots stomped across the wooden porch outside, followed by aggressive pounding on the door. "Cadwell, open up. Sheriff's business." Ben motioned for Eliza to hide behind a stack of iron bars, then opened the door to face Sheriff Mordecai Briggs, a corpulent man whose badge barely covered his expanding gut. Behind him stood 3 deputized thugs, hands resting on their gun handles. "Evening, Sheriff," Ben said calmly. "Bit late for a social call. Cut the pleasantries. We're looking for a thief named Eliza Renwood. Word is you were seen near the old mill around the time she escaped custody." Ben's expression remained neutral. "I was at the mill fixing some machinery for old Peterson. Didn't see any thieves." Briggs pushed past him, his small eyes scanning. "The forge's interior. Mind if we look around?" "Actually, I do mind. You got a warrant?" The sheriff's face reddened. "Don't need one for a honest citizen's cooperation." "Then I guess we're done here," Ben replied, his hand moving casually to rest on a nearby sledgehammer's handle. The tension stretched taut as a bowstring until Briggs finally stepped back. "This ain't over, Blacksmith. That girl's got friends. In high places want her found." After they left, Ben found Eliza trembling behind the iron bars, but her eyes blazed with determination rather than fear. "Tomorrow," she said, "we start gathering evidence. I won't let them destroy any more lives." Ben knelt beside her, their faces inches apart in the flickering firelight. "We'll stop them together," he promised, and when she smiled at him through her tears, he felt something forge itself permanently around his heart. The next morning brought unexpected allies. Ben was heating iron for horseshoe nails when Tobias Flint, the town's leather worker, appeared at his forge with urgent news. "My daughter Mercy went missing 3 weeks ago," Tobias said, his weathered hands shaking. "Sheriff says she ran off with some traveling merchant, but I found this in her room." He handed Ben a crumpled note written in a feminine hand. "Papa, if something happens to me, look for the ledger hidden behind the loose brick in Mrs. Grimsby's cellar. The employment agency is a lie. They're selling us." From her hiding spot behind the forge, Eliza gasped. She emerged slowly, studying the note with growing excitement. "This proves I wasn't the only one who discovered their operation," she told both men. "Your daughter was brave, Mr. Flint. She was trying to expose them." Tobias looked between Ben and Eliza with sharp eyes. "You're the seamstress they're hunting. The one who supposedly stole from the Grimsbys." "The only thing I stole was knowledge of their crimes," Eliza replied firmly. Over the next hour, more craftsmen arrived. Henrik the Cooper, whose niece had vanished, Magnus the miller, whose sister had disappeared after taking a job through the Grimsby Employment Agency, and Cyrus the carpenter, whose daughter had sent similar warnings before vanishing entirely. "They've been picking off our daughters one by one," Ben realized, his anger building like pressure in a steam engine. "Using the sheriff to silence anyone who asks questions." Eliza spread out paper on Ben's workbench and began sketching everything she remembered from the ledgers. Names, dates, destinations where the women had been sent, and payment amounts that made their crime horrifyingly clear. "The spring wagon trains," she said, her pencil flying across the paper. "They coordinate with specific wagon masters who ask no questions. The women are listed as domestic workers bound for mining camps and frontier settlements, but they're slaves," Magnus finished grimly, "sold to the highest bidder." As afternoon approached, their planning session was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, they saw Mrs. Cordelia Grimsby herself, elegant and cold as winter ice, accompanied by 4 armed men who weren't wearing badges but carried themselves like professional gunfighters. "Scatter," Ben ordered quietly. "Back door, all of you except Eliza." The men melted away through his workshop's rear exit, while Eliza concealed herself behind the forge once again. Ben answered Mrs. Grimsby's imperious knock with a respectful nod. "Double quotes, Mrs. Grimsby. What brings you to my humble forge?" She swept inside without invitation, her calculating eyes taking in every detail. "I understand you've been asking questions about missing persons, Mr. Cadwell. Just concerned about my neighbors." "Daughters, ma'am." "Natural enough, I'd say." Mrs. Grimsby's smile was sharp as a blade. "Natural, perhaps, but also dangerous. Young women sometimes make poor choices, Mr. Cadwell. They run away from responsibility, chase dreams that lead them astray. It's not wise to interfere with such natural processes." "And what if they didn't choose to leave?" Ben asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Then you'd be accusing respectable citizens of serious crimes. That would require proof, wouldn't it? The kind of proof that doesn't exist." She moved closer to the forge, her eyes scanning the shadows where Eliza hid. "I've heard rumors about a certain seamstress, a thief who stole valuable items from my home. If someone were harboring such a criminal, they'd be breaking the law," Ben finished. "I understand perfectly." Mrs. Grimsby studied him for a long moment, then nodded to her men. As they filed out, she paused at the doorway. 24 hours, Mr. Cadwell. That's how long reasonable people have to make reasonable choices. After that, circumstances become unreasonable." When they were gone, Eliza emerged from hiding with fire in her eyes. "She knows I'm here," she said. "Let her know," Ben replied, his jaw set with determination. "By tomorrow night, half the county will know what she's been doing." The next 18 hours transformed Ben's forge into the center of a quiet revolution. Word spread through Millbrook Valley's craftsmen like sparks through dry tinder. Every man who'd lost a daughter, sister, or niece to the Grimsby employment agency gathered evidence and rallied allies. Eliza worked tirelessly, documenting everything she could remember, while Ben coordinated their growing network of supporters. By dawn, they had testimony from a dozen families and a detailed map of the trafficking operation scope. "It's bigger than we thought," Eliza said, showing Ben her latest calculations. "They've moved over 60 women in the past 2 years. The profits?" She shuddered. "Enough to buy sheriffs, judges, anyone who might interfere." Their breakthrough came when Henrik the Cooper returned with electrifying news. "I found her," he announced breathlessly. "Found Mercy Flint. The young woman was hidden in a root cellar behind the Grimsby mansion, scheduled for transport that very evening. She was weak from poor treatment but coherent enough to confirm Eliza's account in devastating detail. "There are 3 others with her," Henrik reported, "all waiting for the same wagon train." Ben felt the familiar heat of the forge building in his chest, but this time it was rage refined to its purest form. "Tonight, then, we end this." Their plan was audacious in its simplicity. While Ben created a diversion by confronting Sheriff Briggs publicly at the town tavern, the other craftsmen would liberate the imprisoned women and escort them to safety. Eliza would wait at a predetermined rendezvous point with horses and supplies, but as evening approached, Mrs. Grimsby struck first. Ben was working late at his forge when the building suddenly erupted in flames. Coal oil had been splashed across his wooden walls and ignited from multiple points simultaneously. As he fought his way through the smoke and heat, he realized with horror that the fire had been set to trap him inside. Strong hands grabbed him from behind, Vex and 2 other men, their faces masked against the smoke. Ben's hammer was across the room, useless. But a lifetime of working with fire and iron had prepared him for this moment. He grabbed a red-hot horseshoe from the forge with leather-wrapped tongs and swung it like a weapon. Vex screamed and released him, clutching a burned hand. Ben spun and drove his fist into the second man's solar plexus, then seized the third by his shirt and hurled him bodily into the burning wall. "Where is she?" Vex snarled, still holding his injured hand. "Where's the seamstress?" Ben's answer was a left hook that sent Vex crashing through his window display of finished ironwork. As flames consumed his life's work around him, the blacksmith fought his way to freedom with nothing but his bare hands and implacable fury. Outside, he found chaos. The fire had been a signal. Grimsby's gunfighters were moving through town, rounding up the craftsmen's families as leverage. But they'd underestimated the resolve of men fighting for their daughters' lives. Street battles erupted as the tradesmen fought back with tools turned weapons. Magnus wielded a grain flail like a medieval warrior. Cyrus swung a carpenter's adze with deadly precision. Henrik's leatherworking knives flashed in the firelight as he carved through his opponent's ranks. Through the smoke and confusion, Ben saw Eliza racing toward him on horseback, leading a string of mounts loaded with supplies. Behind her rode Mercy Flint and 3 other rescued women, all armed and ready for the fight of their lives. "The evidence," Eliza shouted, tossing Ben a leather satchel. "Everything we need to destroy them, but only if we can get it to the territorial capital." Mrs. Grimsby appeared at the end of the street, flanked by a dozen gunmen and Sheriff Briggs. Her elegant facade had cracked, revealing the cold-blooded criminal beneath. "Kill them all," she commanded. "Burn the evidence. No witnesses." Ben swung onto the horse Eliza had brought him, the animal dancing nervously in the firelight. Around them, their allies formed a protective circle, craftsmen's tools gleaming like medieval weapons in the chaos. "Together?" Eliza asked, her hand finding his. "Together," Ben confirmed, and they spurred their horses toward the gauntlet of bullets and flames that stood between them and justice. The thundering hooves of their horses echoed through Millbrook Valley as Ben and Eliza led their desperate charge toward freedom. Behind them, gunshots cracked like whips as Mrs. Grimsby's hired killers gave pursuit, but the craftsmen's families had created chaos enough to give them a head start. "The canyon pass," Ben shouted over the wind, pointing toward a narrow gap in the rocky hills that surrounded their valley. "They can't follow us all through there." Eliza leaned low over her horse's neck, the leather satchel containing their evidence pressed tight against her chest. The rescued women rode with surprising skill. Their captivity had been harsh, but farm girls learned to handle horses before they could properly walk. As they approached the canyon, Mercy Flint suddenly cried out, "Riders ahead!" They're trying to cut us off." Indeed, a line of gunmen had positioned themselves at the canyon's mouth. Rifles glinting in the moonlight, Mrs. Grimsby had anticipated their escape route and prepared. Accordingly, Ben's mind raced through alternatives as their horses began to labor up the rocky slope. Behind them, Sheriff Briggs and the main pursuit group were gaining ground. Ahead waited certain death in a crossfire they couldn't possibly survive. This way. Eliza suddenly veered left, guiding her mount toward what looked like a sheer cliff face. "There's an old mining trail. I saw it on the maps in the Grimsby house." Trust blazed through Ben like molten iron. Without hesitation, he followed her lead, calling for the others to stay close. The trail she'd found was barely wider than a deer path, winding treacherously up the canyon wall in switchback turns that tested both rider and horse. Gunfire echoed behind them as their pursuers reached the canyon floor, but the angle was too steep for accurate shooting. Ben allowed himself a moment of hope until he heard the distinctive whistle of an arrow cutting through the air. "Down!" he roared, but the warning came too late. One of the rescued women, a girl named Temperance, cried out as an arrow took her in the shoulder. She swayed in her saddle, threatening to fall to her death on the rocks below Doubt without thinking. Ben wheeled his horse around and grabbed Temperance's reins, steadying her mount while Eliza used her seamstress skills to quickly bind the wound with torn fabric from her dress. "Can you ride?" Ben asked urgently. Temperance gritted her teeth and nodded. "I didn't survive 3 weeks in that cellar to die on a mountain trail." More arrows whistled past them. Indians, Ben realized. The Grimsbys had somehow convinced a war party to help hunt them down, probably with promises of weapons or territory. "Keep moving," Eliza urged. "The trail levels out ahead. I can see it." They pushed their exhausted horses harder, the animals breathing harsh and labored in the thin mountain air. Behind them, their pursuers had dismounted and were following. On foot, gaining ground with every minute, the trail did indeed level out, opening onto a high plateau dotted with ancient pine trees. But their relief was short-lived. More riders waited for them here, emerging from the tree line with weapons drawn. Ben's heart sank as he recognized the lead figure, Judge Horatio Blackwood, supposedly one of the most respected men in the territory. His presence meant the corruption reached even higher than they'd imagined. "End of the line, Blacksmith," Judge Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the bench. "Surrender the evidence and the women, and you'll receive fair treatment under the law, your law or actual law." Ben replied, his hand moving to the hammer that hung at his belt, the only tool he'd managed to salvage from his burning forge. "There's no difference in this territory," Blackwood replied coldly. "I am the law here." Eliza urged her horse forward, placing herself between Ben and the corrupt judge. "Not anymore," she declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I sent copies of everything to the territorial governor 3 days ago. Federal marshals are already en route." It was a bluff, but a convincing one. Ben saw uncertainty flicker across Blackwood's face, followed quickly by murderous rage. "Then you've signed all your death warrants," the judge snarled. "Kill them all. Leave no witnesses." The plateau erupted in gunfire and screaming horses. Ben swung his hammer with devastating effect, crushing the skull of the nearest gunman while Eliza drew a small pistol from her boot and proved she was as deadly accurate as she was beautiful. But they were hopelessly outnumbered. As the battle raged around them, Ben realized their only chance lay not in victory, but in sacrifice. "The evidence," he shouted to Eliza over the chaos. "Someone has to get it through, no matter what happens to the rest of us." She met his eyes across the battlefield, understanding passing between them like steel recognizing steel. "Together," she said firmly, just as she had before. "Together," he agreed, and they rode straight into the heart of the enemy formation. Their love forged stronger than any chain that had ever bound her. The desperate gambit worked better than Ben had dared hope. By charging directly at Judge Blackwood, he and Eliza forced the corrupt official's men to hold their fire or risk hitting their leader. In those crucial seconds, Mercy Flint and the other rescued women scattered into the pine forest, carrying duplicate copies of evidence that Eliza had secretly prepared. "You clever girl," Ben breathed as he realized her deception. "I learned from the best seamstress in the county," Eliza replied with a fierce smile. "Always keep spare patterns." There, horses crashed through the enemy line in a thunder of hooves and steel. Ben's hammer connected with Judge Blackwood's jaw with a crack that echoed across the plateau, sending the corrupt official tumbling from his saddle. But their momentum carried them past the main fight into the open ground beyond. "The pass?" Eliza pointed toward a narrow cut in the far mountains, barely visible in the moonlight. "If we can reach it before they regroup. They spurred their exhausted horses toward the distant gap, but pursuit was already organizing behind them. Sheriff Briggs had finally reached the plateau with the main body of gunmen, and Mrs. Grimsby's cold voice cut through the night air like a blade. $500 for the seamstress alive. 1,000 for both of them dead. The promise of bounty money drove their pursuers to reckless speed. Gunshots rang out as the chase resumed, bullets whining past Ben and Eliza's heads as their horses labored up the rocky slope toward the pass. "There," Ben suddenly pointed ahead. "Riders coming toward us." Eliza's heart sank. More enemies blocking their escape. But as the approaching horsemen drew closer, she recognized something that made her cry out with joy. Federal marshals. Those are cavalry uniforms. Indeed, a full company of territorial militia was riding hard toward the sound of gunfire, their brass buttons gleaming in the starlight. At their head rode a stern-faced man whose badge caught the light, U.S. Marshal Garrett Ironwood, legendary throughout the territory for his incorruptible pursuit of justice. The corrupt officials and hired gunmen realized their predicament. Simultaneously, caught between the federal authorities ahead and the evidence-carrying witnesses behind, the criminal empire was collapsing around them. "Scatter!" Mrs. Grimsby shrieked. "Save yourselves!" But Marshal Ironwood had positioned his men well. Bugles sounded from multiple directions as cavalry units emerged from concealed positions, surrounding the entire plateau in a net of federal law. By authority of the territorial governor, Marshal Ironwood's voice boomed across the mountainside. "I arrest you all for conspiracy, human trafficking, and murder." Judge Blackwood, blood streaming from his broken jaw, made one last desperate attempt to maintain his facade of respectability. "Marshal Ironwood, thank God you're here. These criminals attacked us while we were pursuing escaped prisoners." But Ben and Eliza had reached the federal lines, and Eliza immediately produced the leather satchel containing their documented evidence. "Marshal," she said formally, "I present proof of a human trafficking operation that has enslaved over 60 women from this region." Marshal Ironwood examined the documents by lantern light, his weathered face growing darker with each page. "These ledgers detail financial transactions, shipping routes, and—" His eyes found Mrs. Grimsby across the plateau. "Personal correspondence. Bearing your signature, Mrs. Grimsby." The elegant woman's mask finally slipped completely. "You have no jurisdiction here. This is county business." "Human trafficking is federal business," Marshal Ironwood replied coldly, "as is corrupting territorial officials." His gaze shifted to Judge Blackwood and Sheriff Briggs. "You gentlemen are relieved of your duties pending investigation." The next hour passed in a blur of arrests and testimonies. As dawn broke over the mountains, Ben found himself standing beside Eliza on a rocky outcrop, watching the last of the criminals being loaded into prison wagons for transport to the territorial capital. "It's over," Eliza said wonderingly. "Actually over." Ben nodded, then turned to face her fully. In the morning light, she was more beautiful than ever. No longer the terrified woman he'd found in chains, but a fierce warrior who had helped topple an empire of evil. "What happens now?" he asked Eliza. Stepped closer, her hand finding his. "Now we rebuild. Your forge, our lives, this whole valley. But together." "Together," Ben agreed, and when he kissed her, it felt like the forging of something eternal. Two souls tempered by fire and hammer welded into one unbreakable whole. Below them, Millbrook Valley spread out in the dawnlight, ready for the healing they would bring to it. 6 months later, the sound of Ben's hammer rang out across Millbrook Valley once again. But now it carried a different rhythm, the steady, confident beat of a man building a future rather than merely surviving. Each day, his new forge, raised with the help of grateful neighbors and federal rebuilding funds, stood larger and more impressive than the old one. "The horseshoes are ready for the Patterson Ranch," Eliza called from the workshop's office where she managed the books with the same precision she'd once applied to fine needlework. And Marshall Ironwood sent word that the last of the Grimsby associates has been sentenced. Ben paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched his wife move efficiently through their shared workspace. They'd married 2 weeks after the trials ended, in a ceremony attended by every family whose daughters they'd helped save. Mercy Flint had sewn Eliza's wedding dress, incorporating delicate iron beadwork that Ben had forged himself. 20 years. In federal prison, Ben said with satisfaction. Mrs. Grimsby's empire is finished. The transformation of Millbrook Valley had been remarkable. With the corrupt officials removed and the trafficking ring destroyed, honest law enforcement had taken root. New businesses were opening, young people were staying instead of fleeing to distant cities, and the community had grown stronger through their shared ordeal. "Ben," a familiar voice called from outside. "You've got visitors." Tobias Flint appeared in the doorway, beaming with pride as he ushered in his daughter Mercy and her new husband, an honest young farmer named Josiah Creek. Behind them came a steady stream of other couples, women who had been rescued from slavery finding love with men who valued their strength and courage. "We wanted to thank you both again," Mercy said, her eyes bright with happiness, "and to bring news from the territorial capital." She handed Eliza an official-looking document with impressive seals and ribbons. As Eliza read it, her eyes widened with astonishment. "What is it?" Ben asked. "A commendation from the territorial governor," Eliza said wonderingly, "and a reward. Federal bounties on all the criminals we helped capture." The sum was substantial, enough to expand their business, help rebuild other damaged properties in the valley, and establish a fund for young women seeking honest employment. "There's more," Mercy added with a grin. "They're naming the new county courthouse after you both, the Cadwell-Renwood Justice Center." Ben felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from the forge this time, but from pride and humility combined. "We didn't do it alone," he protested. "Everyone helped." "That's exactly why you deserve the honor," Tobias replied. "You brought us together when we needed each other most." As their friends and neighbors continued to arrive throughout the afternoon, Ben realized this was more than a celebration. It was a homecoming. The community that had been fractured by fear and corruption was healing itself, becoming stronger in the broken places as evening approached and their guests began to depart. Ben and Eliza stood together in their forge, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. The mountains that had once seemed like prison walls now looked like protective barriers, sheltering their peaceful home. "Any regrets?" Ben asked, slipping his arms around Eliza's waist from behind. She leaned back against his solid chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Only one," she said softly. "What's that?" Eliza turned in his arms, her eyes twinkling with mischief and love. "I regret that it took chains and corruption and near-death experiences to bring us together. We could have been happy much sooner, if we just met at a church social like normal people." Ben laughed, the sound rich and warm as forged gold. "Maybe, but then we wouldn't have this story to tell our children." "Our children?" Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Well," Ben said, suddenly bashful despite everything they'd been through together, "I was hoping ... Eliza silenced him with a kiss that tasted like promises and forever. When they finally broke apart, she smiled up at him with eyes that held. No shadows, no fear, only love and infinite possibilities. "Benjamin Cadwell," she said formally, "would you do me the honor of forging a family with me?" "Eliza Cadwell," he replied, using her married name with obvious pleasure. "I thought you'd never ask." As night fell over Millbrook Valley, the forge. Fire burned low but never died, casting dancing shadows on the walls where their tools hung ready for tomorrow's work. They had freed each other from different kinds of chains, she from iron bonds, he from the loneliness that had gripped his heart for so long. Now they were bound together by something far stronger than any metal Ben had ever worked. Love hammered into shape by adversity, tempered by courage, and polished bright by the simple daily choice to stand together against whatever storms might come in the distance. A train whistle echoed across the valley, not carrying stolen women to lives of slavery, but bringing new settlers to a community that had learned the difference between chains that bind and bonds that liberate. The blacksmith and his bride had forged more than just a life together. They had helped forge a future where freedom rang true as the clearest bell, and love proved stronger than any chain that had ever been made.